Hi there, my name is Dr. Travis Holland. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Communication at Charles Sturt University, Australia. This podcast is an exploration into our digital society. It forms the lectures for my class, Envisioning the Digital Society, but also aims to engage you, the listener out there beyond my classroom. If you like what you hear, please send a voice comment through Anchor or Spotify, or get in contact via the details in the show notes. This episode, I'm joined by Professor David Marshall to discuss the various forms of self-presentation on the internet. Specifically, this week is an investigation into what has been called the selfie. And ultimately, we think through how these constitutions of the self are fabricated and, in many ways, explained through an emerging field of study in media and communication called persona studies. Additionally, Dr. Tracy Edmondson discusses how Australian athletes present themselves on their social media and how that has changed in recent times. Welcome to Digital Society. This week we're looking at persona, one of the important topics for thinking about our digital society, and the topic has been prepared by our Professor in Communication, David Marshall. Hi, David.
Hi, Travis. How are you? And how are all you?
Everyone out there, both in our classroom and beyond, is the hope. So, David, let's talk about persona.
Yes. Well, even while we're talking, Travis and I are producing personas. We don't shift from that completely as we go through things. We are academics. We are presenting things to you. And as we do that, we are more or less getting closer to a different identity than probably what we do in the home. And so a way to think of the notion of persona is that we construct it, each of us. It doesn't mean other people don't make us construct it in particular ways, but we do make it up all the time. And the last sort of thing that I'll say before I'll let Travis jump in again and ask me another question is always think of it as, the word I use is fictive, which is just a version of fiction. It's not negative that we're constructing a version of ourselves that's not true. It's that every version of ourselves is a construction. So think about that and integrate that into your way of imagining how you go into a shop, how you go into a class, and how that might be a slightly different version of you.
And this is something that social scientists have looked at for a while, how we perform, thinking of Irving Goffman, for example,
Yes.
The notion of front stage and backstage performances, how you perform on the street is different to how you perform at home. And as you say, it's not that it's not authentic, it's not that it's not who you are, it's just a way of describing how we interrelate to each other and present who we are.
And the interesting thing with what Travis has just gone through is that you also get that feeling that there are layers and layers of the transformation of self, the transformation of our identity. And one of the biggest ones is what's happened in the last 15 to 20 years, where we have mediatized ourselves in a way that's similar to how actors have done it, how news anchors have done it, but is now virtually billions of people doing it all the time. And that's the part that is kind of interesting. We could call it digital persona to get it to that level, but it is another term that I use a little bit regularly. Travis has probably heard it a few times, is pandemic. And it's a pandemic, meaning that it is right through the entire human culture that we make versions that are digital versions of ourselves.
And you, just to be clear for everyone, you started using that term quite a fair way before 2020.
Yeah, a book that I put together in, I think it came out in 2015, 2016, was called Celebrity Persona Pandemic. And that's where, and I wrote it a few years before that, but it was the notion of how we've moved into something so large that it's hard to say that has any constitutive equivalence to the entertainment industry or the news industry or popular culture more widely. We've allowed it to move all the way through us, through our veins.
That's one way to look at it. One aspect of persona that forms a sort of obvious but contested example is the selfie, David.
Yes.
What's a selfie?
Well, certainly, all of you have read a clear definition of selfie that's probably listed somewhere from, it could be Abaddon or Nancy Baim or any of these other authors that are out there. But it's that, we make our own images of ourselves. And that's why it's called a selfie. You may remember, and you probably avoid it, that people started using long sticks to present themselves all over the world. But selfies are something that became possible because of the technology itself. It was way more difficult to imagine people making self-generated images in the 1980s, 1990s to a degree. And that is because it wasn't easy to reverse a phone. It wasn't easy to put it on a delay. And all those things that maybe photographers did, but very few everyday people would make a selfie. They'd always rely on someone else taking the photo.
Yeah, so the selfie became this very kind of postmodern expression of the digital self online through the phone, right? And it's important to think about the phone, the smartphone in particular, as a kind of constitutive element of the selfie culture.
Yeah, and again, that notion of the phone, you guys would not know this at all. I know I sound like I'm about 24, but I'm not. Is that in the 90s, it was actually quite a divide between who had in my original world, a cell phone, and what we would call a mobile phone, and who did not. And the divide was amazingly large and moved economically. So if you had a corporate link, you probably had a mobile phone in the 90s. By the 2000s, it became, I'm going to use that same word, a pandemic. And by the time the smartphone was strongly in place, by the tens, if we can call it that, the teens, it is that dimension that allowed us to play way further with our technology, which originally was just a phone, but became also a visualization of what used to be predominantly auditory.
I'm probably going to start digressing a bit, but I tend to think of infrastructure quite a lot and talk about the infrastructure that facilitates behaviours or affords particular behaviours in certain ways. And the phone effectively is the infrastructure for not just a selfie, but a whole range of self-presentation and other behaviours, in fact.
Yeah, there are interesting differences transnationally. One of the big interesting sort of things, I happen to live in Boston in 2001 to 2007 before I came back to Australia again. And while I was in Boston, it became really clear that they were different than Australians in how they use their technology. And that's a really good word that Travis used, affordance, is something that you should understand. What people took from it and played with it further. What did it allow them to do? So for all of us, what we get into is sometimes something that we see others using. So the weird thing in the United States, that was in Boston, was that kids talked to their parents. They didn't use SMS, as we used to call it, text, at all. In Australia, though, they were texting all the time because of the cost of phone messages and time, actually, in the structure of how it was done in the telecommunication industry in Australia. So, and that was the same as what would have happened in North Africa, probably Europe. But in America, they were still talking. And interestingly, that changed. And texting became much larger as an affordance of what phones provided. And that was an interesting transformation of a generation for some of you, 10 or 15 years older than you, how they learned to play text, how they learned the different techniques of it, even the hashtags relationships to say, what am I meaning? How they learned emoticons to emoji to use in the way that they express themselves.
We started to see with lots of digital technologies a sort of reconfiguring of social relationships, right? And so you've highlighted, David, that social media produces different constitutions of friends and followers than earlier modes of connection. What do you think of some of those changes that we can see?
Well, one of the big changes I think that we can see in the pre-date land, we're talking about blogs. We could be talking about the emergence of podcasts and the emergence of what YouTube was doing, but I think blogs were probably dominant up till about 2005. Mm-hmm. After that, it began to shift what kind of production we were all involved in. What were we making? How did we feel connected to it? And so what the phone did was it made our everyday life, doesn't matter what we're doing. You're listening to Travis and I talk right now. You have no idea where we are, but we're looking at each other. And in a way, a phone could produce that effect all the time and share it to other people. So the movement of data used to cost a lot of money. I remember my parents getting really mad at me making a long-distance phone call when I was about 15 years old, saying, what are you calling someone who is about 400 kilometers away? That cost us $8. Now, $8, if you go in contemporary currency, would be probably about, I spent $60 to talk about 6 minutes. This is something that we don't really realize. We realize it in the idea of buying a mobile phone or structuring it in a different way, the hundreds of dollars it costs. But we lose the sense of everything that we're involved in. It has an economic dimension as much as a cultural connection dimension.
Yeah, and so we can see in that economic structure that the marginal cost of each individual connection comes way, way down to cents or less.
Yes.
For each individual call or text or selfie uploaded.
Yes. And we realize and we get comfortable with it, whether we've gone Android or iPhone, Apple. We think that they are doing some security aspect with what we're doing, making us feel kind of secure as we go through. However, we're also aware that the technology produces other affordances. It allows other people to track us all over, and we experience that every day. I was told I had a tax issue today based on a city I'd never lived in my life. It was saying this is where I owed taxes. This happens all the time to all of us, and now we have to strategically say whether that identity of even things that come as text is real, or is it botted, if we can call it that.
And that's a bit of a change from most of human history, right, where writing was kind of authoritative because there was some cost to producing it.
Yeah.
Or at least distributing it for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, the cost of making a book, newspapers, it doesn't really matter. Even the movement of envelopes, as you guys would know, in mail systems was the main pathway of information for a century. Those things began to break down at different times. It's also interesting to always be aware that what we think of as incredibly normal for a certain generation was not normal for the generation who was probably in their 60s or 70s when the phone came into existence at the turn of the last century. We're talking 1900. They would have been offended by phones in the house. And if there's something that most of us don't know about phones 130 years ago, is that they put them in hallway stairwells so that they would not bother the house. They were never in the public rooms. They were in the hallway rooms, which were ways of backing your way out of a kind of public conversation. And that gets us to those gaps. I'll let Travis ask the question between public and private.
I almost was going to go down
a different route,
a whole other route, but that gave me this thought of there's become this trend on Instagram and some other social networks of the aesthetic of liminality, right? And they refer to these places as liminal spaces. I don't know if you've seen this. I had a conversation on Mastodon with some other academics recently about it. This notion of a liminal space as effectively being an abandoned or a haunted space, but it's actually liminal means transitional, right? And so it's quite interesting to me, that connection that I can see a connection there between what you described as the notion of the telephone coming into the home, but occupying this liminal space. It was a technology that helped to shift society, and in some ways society is always shifting, but there are also points at which we can say, here's a shift occurring here, and the introduction of the telephone and other long-distance communication technologies was part of that, but it also occupied this liminal space in the home. And so the transitional liminal phase of both technology, like the telephone being introduced, and also the physical space that it occupied, is an interesting random little hole to go down.
Think of these sorts of things as how close you are to the technology itself, how much it has become part of you. And these are things like, now, all of us are different, but we all carry certain things in our pocket. The reality now is the phone has become part of us, almost in the same way as we could call it, something bionic. It's an extension of ourselves in some ways, a technology that takes us one level further. But maybe just think about what you carry with you every day and how frustrated you get when you don't bring that sort of thing. And that sort of thing, whatever it is fundamentally part of you. And what Travis is getting to there, that liminality and then transition, is when a technology comes into play. And so if we think of the phone being around for 120 years, its different structuration is amazing to think about where and how it was played at different times. One of the things that happened in a place like Bathurst or in country New South Wales is they would have what were called party phones. And party phones were, you couldn't predict who could jump in and listen to you on your phone because it was connected to maybe 100 houses. And people would just pick up their phone, even though it was a conversation between two people at two different places in a country world, and listen in. The party phone, if you think of it, is exactly what's happened with, it doesn't matter, Instagram, Facebook, and the kinds of video chats that are now common and put into place as a normal, beyond the liminal aspect of our everyday lives. They become something that if we did not bring it, as we went to a train station, we would lose the connection to 4 or 5 people that we feel as if we should be connected to at that time.
Yep.
And that's something that all of you can get into, is what do you do in those moments that you think of, they're not related to phones, and yet you're constantly drawn back to those conversational structures. Videos, photos, text.
If we could pursue that thread for a little longer, I saw a recent, quite strange conversation on Twitter where there were sort of two people replying to each other in a thread, and a third person joined the thread. And one of the people in the original sort of conversation was like offended, felt like she was being interrupted, like a sort of private conversation happening on the public timeline on Twitter was being interrupted by this third person. And in her mind, it seemed to be similar to, if you were having a conversation with someone on the street and a third sort of unknown stranger just joined in the conversation as if they were part of it. But that kind of misunderstands the publicness of the medium.
Yeah, and you're getting close to some of those issues. We do not fully have the aspect of, we could call it the big word, publicity, of what our technology, the mobile phone, the affordances it produces, and its relationship to others. We don't fully understand it. We think we do. We've naturalized it to a high degree. But in a sense, the people like us, and as you go through university, you're kind of doing the same thing. We haven't interpreted it entirely. Saying, so when you were describing that Twitter moment, that's an exact moment where you say, why didn't they personalize it and privatize their conversation if they did not want the thread to go? And that is something that would be normal across direct messaging sort of structures,
Yep.
DMs, in almost every social media platform. The interesting thing is that we all have that idea that we want to connect further. And that is fascinating because it is related to how we see our, and I'll use that word that, pops up, it's now connected to persona, our influence is interpreted, graded, calibrated, and put into all the networks that we live in and through every day of our lives.
You were talking about the difference or distinction between public-private a little bit there, and that gets us to this notion of privilege.
Yeah. So, privilege is an interesting term that I made up. It's a combination of private and public put together, and how we have moved into a different era where we're much more comfortable with understanding that we're moving between public and private. Travis captured a Twitter moment very clearly that moved into other platforms as well around it. But it is that notion that we have all sorts of levels of ourself, personal, private, professional, intimate, that play themselves off and through what we do in our social media structures, in our phone, every day of our lives. And in that way, and this is that interesting thing, remember I was talking about what you carry with you all the time? Technically, I'm carrying some sort of larynx that is producing this sound to you. So I have this capacity of trying to work out how I change, how I move my voice, how I express sorts of emotion and connection to it. Privilege is capturing our movement between private and public, personal and collective, in a way that we are transforming, in a sense, human culture. And the beauty of working this through in a thinking way right now in a class is you may come up with some insights that are really interesting about what things are going and how they are going.
To complicate that notion a little further, the
Really?
podcast, the notion of this podcast being both a lecture for a private group of students, in a sense, or a collective group of students undertaking a particular class, but also something that we're putting on the internet for anyone to listen to respond to use in their own interesting ways, and to hopefully find some value in the conversation as well, really finds it takes a mix between those different aspects as well. It's kind of, well, a class is public. It's a public institution to an extent, but also if you haven't paid for the privilege of being in that classroom at that time, whether online or on campus, what right do you have to the material being produced and being discussed?
Yeah.
Compared to, this is a podcast that's going out onto the public internet. But you and I both, and other people that I've had conversations with for the podcast, struggle to come up with the language to talk either directly to the students who we hope are listening, or to the public who might be listening, who we don't have necessarily a great conception of either. So
no, and this is the aspect of a kind of long history of sort of media studies about, an industry that constructed those relationships and constructed a public presentation of the self that was normal for actors, normal for news anchors and reporters, normal for all sorts of people that were using and part of the media, including when a private individual was interviewed with a microphone sticking into their face as they, reported, a terrible crisis, a death in the family. This has changed in the aspect that it's not that those ideas and presentations of the self were not out there before. It's that we have now a different constitution of private and public that we're still working out as to how it is shaping us. And as you described in that one on Twitter, sometimes offending us to such a degree that someone would jump in as if they were on a street corner and start talking as if they were part of the conversation. And we have all experienced that. We're shocked by it. We've all experienced political dimensions of that. Whether you've looked at really interesting politics in Finland and Sweden, of leaders and leaders of countries that have gone completely into social media, or whether you go into the bizarre one who gets taken out of it, Donald Trump in the United States, and has to move off into other dimensions of social media for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and again, the notion of splintering public networks up into, like, literally into echo chambers, right? So you get kind of right-wing social networks establishing themselves in response to what they perceive as a kind of overbearing left-wing voice on existing networks.
Yeah, and those are interesting things too, Travis, because we do get caught up in, as you say, an echo chamber. Other terms that are used are echo bubbles. They're not complete. In other words, they're not completely stopping someone else going into it. The interesting thing that you'll notice that you even see in Parliament, in Australian Parliament, is you'll see people speaking as if they are presenting facts. And the more you listen to it, I'm not going to get into the details of it, you realize that they have only looked at a range of other material around a particularly strange, possibly dangerous political direction. I'm not going to get into details. You might want to talk about those things further, but you have all sorts of examples that sound incredibly, almost scientific when they present, and yet it is made up.
Yeah, absolutely. Jump back to Selfie for a moment. The world's most famous selfie, we might call it the 2014 Oscars selfie with Ellen DeGeneres, which became very quickly one of the world's most retweeted tweets since Twitter had begun. And you talk about a moment at which you recreated it. So I'm interested in asking a question. First, if you could tell the story about that sort of recreation. But also, the actual question is, what would drive us to look at a selfie as a cultural object that we might take this unit and participate in it by recreating? Yeah.
One of the things I'll give you the background and then I'll try to say what was going on. So, yes, Ellen DeGeneres, Oscars 2014, produced this incredibly interesting image of some of the leading actors of that period. And it was one of the most prevalent selfies on the planet. Continues to be there. It's not hard for you to find it. You could find it almost anywhere. And I was actually, if you read the material that you might want to read, I was actually in Cologne in Germany, and they decided we had that image on the cover of our book. A Companion to Celebrity is the name of the book. I'm not promoting anything here, Travis.
No, that's fine. We'll put a link to the book like I do. I have another podcast, and if we talk about a book or a publication or a podcast or a website, we always put links to it. So that's exactly what's going to happen here. So A Companion to Celebrity by P. David Marshall and Sean Redmond.
That's right.
Will be in the show notes.
So this was the book launch, and these basically at a university, they call it Köln in Cologne in Germany. Köln. Get used to that. Do you want me to say it again? Köln. Someone's going to come back at me on Twitter and take me apart.
Tell you that, yeah.
But, and they wanted to reproduce it amongst ourselves. So the image that's so famous that Ellen DeGeneres didn't take, it was actually Bradley Cooper who took it for her, was designed actually by Samsung. It was actually a promotional sort of structure behind it. And I still don't know how my book, or our book, since they're co-author with Sean Redmond, how we were even allowed to reproduce that image in a private publication. We were never charged with the fee of having that image, but it made us make this second image when we launched the book. And we all felt that we were involved in some aspect of the selfie, as you can describe it as a movement. You could see that whatever expression you have seen with selfies is a version of something that you've seen before when you've looked at a selfie. We all go into something, and this is where I'm getting into what Travis wanted to find out, is something that I would describe as trending now. And it might be a different expression. We might pucker our lips. We might close one eye, which is kind of sicko. But we might do all sorts of things that we know are connected to other people. One of the things I've noticed, and this is much more an Insta to TikTok thing, is that there is a certain dancing style that everybody tends to do in terms of the movement of their hands and the movements of their legs when they're trying to present some notion that there is music in the background. And yes, on one level, it's individualized. On another level, everybody recognizes the style as almost the same as a dance style from the 1950s that we'd all say, oh yeah, everybody's dancing the samba. I don't know. I'm just making it up. And this is something that we're all involved in. We are engaged in a public-private movement, a movement into a public area, every time we do a selfie, which is all about being kind of private.
We'll make sure we share also your academic free-created selfie as part of it. And a link to the Ellen one in case there's people listening who've not seen it. I'm looking at it and thinking about, you mentioned trending, and of course Ellen has greatly fallen. At that point you might say she was the center of sort of American celebrity culture, really. But things have radically changed.
Yeah, nighttime and daytime shows is what she was involved in, and massively connected to, as her partner, an Australian originally, isn't it? Yes. Portia de Rossi, is that right? Yeah. And we have within that massive impact across the planet. I'd have to say that one of the things that hit her was a lot of different dimensions that have taken her down. One was, just actually as COVID came in, she did a very bizarre self-generated image from home because they weren't going into the studio to do things. And you realized that she was looking opulent in terms of the shape of her house. And there were all sorts of critiques that were going on about Ellen. Then, also with Ellen, she was taken apart for the harassment that was all a part of her television show. And that led to, yes, Ellen retiring, but it was on track before that show was going to disappear. A change in culture. Ellen DeGeneres' long history of a total relationship to television, televisual culture, and its mass dissemination into something that is personalized on a minor sort of level, played out into the meaning of her program itself.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to cover off, David? We've covered a lot of ground. A lot of ground.
Yeah. I've made images of those relationships whenever I've presented things on Persona. It's often good to go through the various words, and we've done that, the professional to the private to the intimate, work out those dimensions that are there and think about them. We are in an interesting, let's call it a selfie persona world. And I'm happy to say I think I've kind of covered it. But thanks, Travis, for allowing me to.
No problem. Before you go, I'm going to jump into one more thing, which is each week I try to introduce a bit of a theory that might be useful in thinking about digital culture and digital society. Mm-hmm. This week it's cybernetics, which I'm sure you know plenty about. It's a somewhat older theory. It seems pretty complex when you first look at it, but despite the sort of apparent complexity of the idea, cybernetics really just means feedback, right? It's about the feedback or the feedback loop between a human and a machine, or if you want to get a bit more abstract, between any actor and any other actor, really. But that gets into actor network theory, which I won't do.
we have a bit of a joke in our household, which is a lot of cybernetics came from I'll give you the background of the joke. I won't do the joke immediately because you may or may not know these people. But one of the persons who came up with cybernetics is Herman Kahn. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that would predate it by 300 years was a man named Immanuel Kant. Now, the interesting thing is that whenever we're doing something, when someone says, I can't do that, we would say, Immanuel Kant, but Herman Kahn. It's a terrible joke.
That is a dad-level pun.
But what's interesting about cybernetics, and this is where you guys have to come back and get into this, is that there is an understanding of positive and negative feedbacks. And it's the opposite of what we think is the meaning of it. So a negative feedback pulls you back into kind of, think of it as a thermometer reacting to a temperature. You know, Travis and I are freezing here, so the thermometer system, a thermostat system is not working.
I just keep my air conditioner too cold for you.
And that is the feedback of what a thermostat tries to do, is to try to say, yep, you want 21 degrees, here's 21 degrees, we will stop making it colder. But it is negative feedback, because as soon as it goes in another direction, it's not there. Positive feedback is it goes up and up and up and up and up. Nothing is stopping it. It seems to be there. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting to get into that sort of thinking about how do we feed back to each other? And our world has happened for about 60 to 70 years that we think of cybernetics. It's the basis of computer science. Yes, no sort of structures. Positive, negative. 0, 1 as the binary structure of how meaning has been remade, in a sense, in the last 70 years.
A slightly more complex way to think of the yes-no is, if this condition exists, then do that, which is often what programming languages are based on. If this, then that. For me, the word cybernetics encapsulates systems and the information sort of flowing across them. So I'm going to put a link to a very accessible reading by ANU Professor Genevieve Bell called Touching the Future, which was published in the Griffith Review. And in that, Genevieve gives a very sort of historicised and widespread reading on what cybernetics means today. It's quite an interesting text. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. One more note on the origin of the word. It was adapted from a Greek word, kubernetes. I hope I've probably pronounced that incorrectly. Kubernetes. Kubernetes. Kubernetes, which means a steersman. And so I always often note to students that, to me, that reflects the notion that we have to steer and shape technology lest it shape us too much. We can't be passive.
It's true, and it is an amazing sort of thing that we constantly have to see as part of our making a kind of good life, even though it is scientifically put into a system. And that system is difficult to read unless you understand this process of cybernetics.
Tracy Edmondson is back with a final case study, this time looking at how sporting stars present themselves online, and in particular, their selfies. Tracy, take it away.
Thank you, Travis. There's certainly no shortage of material for this particular topic, and obviously having to stick to the actual selfie as opposed to the sports stars selfie, as opposed to selfies that other people have taken with them and used, which have also been quite damaging. But for this particular case study, what I've done is, and what I've noticed is more for me a real transformational evolution of the sports star selfie, so to speak. Pretty much from, I guess, after the early 2010s, they talk about the latest iPhone models seem to have given, a real rise to the popularity of the selfie post on social media. And if I look at some of the posts in 2013 compared to now, 10 years later, there's definitely been a real shift. And I think a lot of that probably came with, whether it's education and not really understanding young people, it's a shiny new toy doing these selfies, and there's a lot of mistakes. If you look back at 2013, I can pick a particular case of a former NRL player who posted an image of himself with a vodka cruiser, and he was on a rooftop. He was actually meant to be at a recovery session for training at the very time that he posted this image. He, a few hours later, got a knock on the door from the football manager from the club asking him to appear before the board, at which point he was sacked. So there's been a number of these types of incidences in those early years, which cost not only sports stars, but I'm sure other celebrities and people, lost income, jobs, sponsorships, etc., as a result of some irresponsible selfie posts. There's others, players posting nude shots of themselves in the bathroom, etc., which they don't necessarily get a fine for, but it's not some of them, in terms of reputation, brand, not only themselves but their club, not ideal. Other athletes I found during that time used social media selfie to express their frustration about what was a new trend for media in using these athletes' social media accounts and channels and posts, etc., for actual news. So quite often there, and I know from speaking with sports journalists where they had staff on whose job was just to troll accounts and find stories. This also came at a time which has been mentioned other times during this course where media was struggling to get access to athletes or looking for content because they have so much to feel that they're constantly after new and fresh and exclusive content. So they go looking for it when they can't find it. So they go to the social media accounts, and quite often they would just report it as news, not actually even verifying anything. So there was an example that I was given by an AFL spokesperson who was also frustrated with this new reporting style, and he spoke of an example of a joke tweet that had an accompanying selfie pic of two players who were leaving this club in Melbourne and going over to Perth to play, and they'd put on there that they were in this nice little car journey across the Nullarbor, and media reported it like it was this, how amazing these two guys were driving over there together, etc. It wasn't actually true. One of them's married with a family. He wouldn't have been moving over with this guy anyway, but nobody ever checked the story. They never fact-checked it. They ran it as if it was true. Just again highlighting, media use of these types of selfies, which again frustrate athletes, frustrated people working in sporting organisations. But if you sort of fast forward a little to now, I've noticed there's definitely a real change in the way athletes are using social media channels. You could say that they've really grown up or matured. It's more business-like. It's very deliberate with the interactions that they have. I think a lot of them have actually, they understand better now the value of their own brand and the power of, and they're more aware and open to using social media channels to further commercialise that brand value. I gave another example there of in the illustrations there of a player, pictures of him getting engaged, pictures of him with a product he's endorsing, the new men's aftershave, etc. So very, very different to the types of, vodka cruiser on the rooftop type shot that started back in 2013. And there's a lot of figures that sort of support how Facebook has got some numbers of how sports fans are coming to Instagram because they want to see the personal side of athletes. And apparently 80% of people who follow sports accounts follow individual athletes for that reason.
And as you say, there's been this real evolution towards this more professional approach to brand management for a lot of athletes, I guess, which is, evidence of the idea of that you have this authenticity, but also it's more managed at the same time. It's a sort of difficult tension that we're starting to see in the management of persona online, I think, as well. So.
Absolutely right. I mean, I think that speaks to, some of those theories and things like about that managing self and managing, what you actually want people to see of you. I think when they first started, it was a real warts and all, whatever you saw, you got, but now it is as much as they want to show some personality, but it is also quite managed as well. Real interesting juggle in how they do that.
Thanks to Dr. Edmondson and Professor Marshall for their contributions to this episode. If you've enjoyed what you're hearing, give us a rating or some feedback. We'd love to drop your voice note into a future episode and join us next time. My name is Travis Holland. This is Digital Society.